Chapter 14: The Collapse of Communism. The quandaries facing anti-revisionism's survivors were exacerbated by the dramatic late 1980s changes in the USSR and China. First, there was the impact of Soviet perestroika, restructuring, the most sweeping attempt to revitalize socialism since the Chinese Cultural Revolution 2 decades earlier, though launched from a very different perspective. Perestroika's key components were glasnost, openness, democratization, and economic reforms aimed at reversing the Soviet economy's stagnation via a combination of limited market mechanisms and deployment of modern technology. Its foreign policy dimension, the new way of thinking, stressed humanity's common interest in survival and called for cooperation between capitalist countries and socialist countries to stop the nuclear arms race, prevent environmental catastrophe and regional conflicts, and foster economic development in the impoverished global south, a breath of fresh air. In its early phases, perestroika unleashed a wave of creativity and enthusiasm within the USSR and captured the imagination of millions around the world. Especially effective was Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's all-out peace offensive, which included pulling back from Afghanistan, a unilateral moratorium on nuclear testing, and comprehensive proposals for the elimination of nuclear weapons. These put Reagan on the political defensive and forced even the hawks then directing U.S. foreign policy to accept some limits on their nuclear buildup in the form of the 1987 Intermediate Nuclear Force (INF) Treaty eliminating medium and shorter-range nuclear missiles. Within the socialist movement, Gorbachev also moved decisively to alter the long-standing relationship between the CPSU, other communist parties, and the rest of the left. Overtures were made to the Communist Party of China, and the new CPSU leadership signaled that it no longer viewed communist parties as the sole legitimate representatives of working-class aspirations, and was prepared to deal with non-communist left parties on an equal basis. Gorbachev called for a new culture of mutual relations among progressives and stated that the CPSU was not in any way claiming a monopoly on truth, but was engaged in a search ourselves. Though the effort to renew Soviet socialism ultimately failed, from 1985 to 1989 perestroika and new thinking gave a tremendous boost to the communist movement and the left. It paired Reaganism's demonization of the USSR and raised hopes around the world that the Soviet Union could evolve into a society where the population not only enjoyed relative economic security but possessed democratic liberties and exercised political power. It began to break down decades of mistrust within the left and raised expectations for disarmament and social advance, infusing popular movements with energy and optimism. Most survivors of the new communist movement, like the rest of the left, responded with enthusiasm to the USSR's putting Reagan on the defensive and to the call for an overhaul of the Soviet system. But for veterans of the anti-revisionist movement there was an unusual twist. Perestroika's fresh air was blowing from a direction that ran almost directly counter to the doctrines that had long defined their outlook. Those doctrines had pilloried the CPSU for abandoning class confrontation and had postulated that any revitalization of socialism would have to come via a decisive turn to the left. But while Gorbachev proclaimed a return to true Leninist principles, his way of doing so was unmistakably a shift to the right. Whether in its Maoist or Stalinist versions, anti-revisionism was based on the premise that the CPSU had betrayed Marxism-Leninism when Khrushchev attacked Stalin and replaced his allegedly revolutionary policies with peaceful coexistence, relaxation of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and market-oriented reforms. Allegedly, this move was against the wishes and the interests of the Soviet working class, and any future effort to put the CPSU back on track would have to repudiate Khrushchev's opportunism. Perestroika took a totally different tack. Gorbachev argued that Khrushchev had gone in the right direction, and that the problem was that he hadn't gone far enough. Perestroika's advocates insisted that Khrushchev had only scratched the surface in his criticisms of Stalin and that it was time to get at the roots of the problems of Stalinism. Instead of returning to the genuine Marxist-Leninist view that Khrushchev's stress on peaceful coexistence was a pillar of opportunism, New Thinking declared that peaceful coexistence was even more crucial for socialist policy than it had been in 1956. While anti-revisionists long had ridiculed notions about universal values as bourgeois propaganda, Gorbachev projected socialism as the main champion of universal human values, and instead of tightening the proletarian dictatorship, Perestroika called for reducing the role of the instrument of that dictatorship, the party, and for promoting civil liberties and pluralist political structures. While the anti-revisionist critique had charged that the USSR gave insufficient support to national liberation struggles, Gorbachev pulled back further from supplying aid to insurgent movements. He argued that Moscow did not have the resources to match Washington, and that demonstrating that the alleged Soviet threat was a bogeyman would heighten political pressure on the U.S. and result in a net gain for the national liberation struggles. While anti-revisionists condemned almost all reliance on market reforms as capitulation to capitalism, Perestroika proposed more extensive use of market mechanisms than Khrushchev ever had, and attributed the stagnation of the Soviet economy ultimately to Stalin's abandonment of Lenin's market-oriented new economic policy. Moreover, as Perestroika's supporters put these views into practice, they struck a chord among the Soviet people. Whatever else Perestroika did or didn't do, it clearly unleashed a tide of pent-up discontent. The anti-democratic structures Stalin had put in place were a main target of criticism, and there were widespread calls for a full accounting of the repression and persecution perpetrated in the Stalin era. The anti-revisionists claimed that Stalinism represented the true will of the Soviet majority, thwarted only by a small clique of revisionists, became not just untenable but ludicrous. Under these circumstances, it's no surprise that the most orthodox anti-revisionist survivors were hostile to Perestroika. Stalin's longtime defenders in the CLP, for instance, denounced Gorbachev as an ultra-revisionist from the outset. Even within the mainstream communist movement, the parties around the world that had done the least to de-Stalinize were suspicious of Gorbachev. Thus the CPUSA leadership expressed rhetorical support for Perestroika and Glasnost, but consistently downplayed the scope of the changes being implemented and the degree of criticism being directed at the per-1985 Soviet system. Somewhat surprisingly, Line of March emerged as one of the most ardent backers of Gorbachev on the U.S. left. This was a doctrinal turnabout from the group's previous defense of Stalin, its pride in orthodoxy, and its criticisms of the CPSU and CPUSA from the left. The reasons lay in Line of March's peculiar road from anti-revisionism to a pro-Soviet position. The constant in this trajectory was not infatuation with the Soviet Union or Stalin, but opposition to U.S. imperialism and a corollary embrace of the enemy of my enemy is my friend logic. Thus, even in the group's most pro-Soviet phase, Line of March did not view the USSR as a society without flaws, but rather as a bulwark against the U.S. Its cadre were thus disposed to look with favor on an attempt to shake up Soviet society. Additionally, Line of March's emphasis on coalition building and mass movements put it in touch with the excitement Gorbachev was beginning to generate on the left. The biggest doubts among Line of March cadre centered on slacking Soviet support for national liberation movements, the group's main international reference point. But in the early years of Perestroika, leaders of the main Third World insurgencies welcomed the Soviet reform effort. They were acutely aware of the USSR's technological and economic inferiority, and they knew from bitter experience that Washington's ability to demonize the USSR was a key factor in maintaining popular support in the West for interventionism. The CPC repudiates anti-revisionism. For those who still took their cues from Beijing, LRAs and FRSO, developing a consistent response to Perestroika was even more complicated. The CPC welcomed Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, and signs of a Sino-Soviet thaw were evident almost from the outset of Gorbachev's tenure. But the Chinese party was suspicious about glasnost and democratization, not least out of concern about their potential resonance within China. An even deeper problem lay on the level of ideology, and it affected not just U.S. groups' attitude toward Perestroika but toward China. Even before Gorbachev assumed power, the CPC had discarded every major tenet of the anti-revisionist outlook it had once championed. Top Chinese leaders announced bluntly that the Soviet Union is a socialist country, and now we can say so, thus in a mere dozen words repudiating the theoretical justification for 2 decades of Chinese foreign policy. Soon it was evident that the CPC's rethinking had gone even further. In a 1986 interview appearing in Monthly Review, the head of Beijing's Institute of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong said that Lenin's theory of the inevitability of wars between imperialist countries is no longer valid, and revisionism is a special terminology designating only Edward Bernstein. Meanwhile, in practical policy, the Chinese ruling party was moving full speed ahead with market-oriented reforms and integration into the world capitalist economy while popularizing slogans like "to get rich is glorious." The new CPC position left the few pro-China groups that still existed in other countries ideologically adrift. Naturally, it was still possible for any particular group to hold fast to some or all of the old anti-revisionist positions. But the proposition that there was one true Marxist-Leninist tradition stretching in unbroken continuity from Lenin through Stalin, Mao, and the CPC to the present day could no longer be defended. Thus Beijing's supporters found themselves in the same spot as pro-Soviet communists, for whom perestroika shattered the myth of a continuous noble Marxist-Leninist tradition passing through a slightly different list of parties and leaders. But belief that such a pure revolutionary tradition existed, and that one's own group was a contemporary expression of it, was crucial to maintaining the cohesion of almost every small communist group. Without it, even the most minor problem in immediate political work could set off a fatal ideological chain reaction. This is why the tiny groups best able to survive, no matter how off-base their views appear to most of the left, are those that proclaim absolute loyalty to some such tradition, whether Stalinist, Maoist or Trotskyist. Neither LRS nor FRESO probed these matters much in the late 1980s. Their priority was immersion in the rainbow and other arenas of practical work. Doctrinally, both tried to combine support for the CPC with advocacy of the anti-revisionist premises Beijing had now abandoned. While acknowledging, later than most, that big changes were underway in the USSR, they offered no analysis of perestroika and had virtually nothing of substance to say about it to the thousands whose attention was riveted on the Soviet reform effort. 1989, the deluge. Thus, even before 1989, the ideological foundations of the new communist movement were in shambles. Indeed, because communists of different varieties had long argued that the living proof of their worldview was the ability of the USSR or China to build socialism, the travails of these countries meant that every brand of Marxism-Leninism was sorely besieged. Then came the deluge. The upheavals of 1989 began in China. The trigger was the April 15 death of Hu Yaobang, a former CPC general secretary who had lost his post for being too sympathetic to political liberalization. 2 days after Hu's passing, students took to the streets demanding the right to freer political expression and an end to leadership corruption. The student action sparked a broader protest movement, and on May 16 to May 19 more than 1 million people demonstrated in Beijing. This was another moment when the whole world was watching. The international media were on the scene to cover the summit then taking place between Mikhail Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping. The meeting officially normalized relations between the USSR and China after a break of almost 30 years. The government declared martial law the day after Gorbachev left. When hundreds of protesters refused to leave Tiananmen Square, People's Liberation Army troops cleared the area, killing an undetermined number. 6. The massacre, made vivid by the image of a single protester confronting a column of tanks, met all but universal condemnation. On the U.S. left, it snapped the allegiance of almost all of the remaining pro-China groups to the CPC. LRS condemned the killings. Besides the sincerity of that position, the group, which had a large portion of its base among Chinese Americans and had built broad political ties via the Jackson campaign, had nothing to gain and everything to lose by defending the CPC's repression. FRESO also condemned the crackdown. Backing for Beijing's action came only from part of the CPUSA leadership and from the Workers' World Party, and it was more than a little ironic that both these groups had been harsh critics of the new communist movement during its pro-China heyday, while not a single group that had originated in 1970s Maoism supported the CPC. The killings in Beijing were a tremendous blow to the CPC's prestige and to the image of socialism and communism in general. But even this catastrophe paled in comparison to the events that unfolded between 1989 and 1991 in the Soviet bloc. In trouble on the economic front for some time, perestroika's rapid tumble downward began after Gorbachev's return from his meeting with Deng in Beijing. July saw the eruption of a wave of strikes by Soviet coal miners, the first large-scale labor unrest in the USSR since the 1920s. The miners' leadership allied with Boris Yeltsin, who represented the layer of the ruling elite that was no longer interested in reforming socialism but in restoring capitalism. The next month the lid began to come off in Eastern Europe after Gorbachev made it clear that Moscow was no longer willing to send in Soviet tanks to prop up unpopular regimes. Between August and November, communist rule evaporated in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany, and shortly thereafter in the two Balkan states that were not Soviet satellites, Yugoslavia and Albania. The symbol of this sea change was the tearing down of the Berlin Wall on November 9, as people from both sides of the long-divided city ripped out chunks of the edifice with their bare hands while once feared East German border guards stood and watched. In the ensuing months, the Soviet Union itself descended into economic disaster and interethnic strife. The final blow came August 19, 1991 with a coup attempt by a group of top CPSU leaders one day before a new union treaty was to be signed that would have devolved significant power from Moscow to the various constituent Soviet republics. The plotters placed Gorbachev under house arrest, while Yeltsin swung into opposition and gathered a sizable crowd of his supporters in front of the Russian parliament building. The leaders of the coup were unable or unwilling to get troops to fire on the Yeltsin-led resistance and lacked a clear strategy or large-scale public support, and their effort quickly collapsed. In the resulting power vacuum, Yeltsin conducted what amounted to an equally illegal but much more successful counter-coup. Gorbachev resigned as General Secretary of the CPTSU and proposed that the Central Committee dissolve the party. The centrifugal forces at work in the USSR were now unchecked, and in December the USSR officially ceased to exist, with Yeltsin-ruled Russia taking the former USSR's seat on the UN Security Council, amid declarations by the new rulers of Russia and most of the other former Soviet and Eastern European states that socialism was unworkable. The world's first sustained attempt to build an alternative to capitalism came to an end. Crisis for the entire left. The collapse of the USSR and the accompanying surge of capitalist triumphalism spread demoralization throughout the communist left, but to many people's surprise, it also dealt a blow to all other socialist trends and provoked, or more accurately, revealed, a full-blown crisis for the entire left. Of course, left-wing critics of the USSR argued that the Soviet Union had little or nothing in common with their vision of socialism, and that they had long favored sweeping Stalinism away. But despite these arguments, left-wing critics of the USSR gained no new mass support, and especially in the advanced capitalist countries, actually declined in influence alongside the communists. The reasons were plain enough. Despite the deep-seated flaws in the Soviet system, for decades it had been the main counterweight to imperialism. Its collapse gave Western capitalists a freer hand to bully the Third World and impose social austerity at home without feeling much need to make concessions to social democratic or liberal parties and programs. In the eyes of most people across the globe, the Soviet Union was the mainstay of socialism, and its humiliating demise discredited socialism despite the protests of a few small groups on the left. Further, the Soviet debacle demobilized many organizations and individuals who, whatever the flaws in their ideology, had been anchors of popular movements, thus weakening progressive forces across the board. And in the wake of the Tiananmen massacre, it was especially difficult to convince many people that socialism's problems stemmed only from Soviet blunders or betrayals and not from major problems in the socialist project per Southeast. To be sure, there were a few late 1980s developments from which the international left could take heart. By far the most important was the surging democratic movement in South Africa, which led to Nelson Mandela's release from prison in February 1990, and within a few years, to the end of apartheid and an overwhelming ANC victory in the country's first non-racial elections. The dismantling of apartheid was a tremendous boost to progressive and anti-racist movements worldwide, and the South African Communist Party's crucial role in the victory was the main counterexample to the dismal performance of communist parties in China and the former Soviet bloc. In numerous countries, founding Marxist-Leninists seized upon SSCP leader Joe Slovo's 1990 pamphlet "Has Socialism Failed?" as an ideological lifeline. The article combined a self-critical and unequivocal condemnation of Stalinism with defense of the Leninist tradition and the socialist ideal. But in most other countries where progressive movements had surged during the 1980s, the 1989-91 period brought dashed hopes and defeat. The Sandinistas were defeated in February 1990 elections. The 1992 peace settlement in El Salvador gave the left far less than the goals for which the FMLN had long fought. Jean-Bertrand Aristide became Haiti's first democratically elected president, only to be overthrown by a coup in September 1991. In the wake of these setbacks, the main left parties in all these countries either splintered or lost strength. So did the once strong organizations of the Palestinian left. Elsewhere in the Middle East, meanwhile, the world saw the most vivid proof of imperialism's new freedom of action. Washington seized upon Iraq's August 2, 1990 invasion of Kuwait to demonstrate that it was now the world's sole superpower. The U.S. government pulled out all the stops to demonize Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein, whom Washington had previously supported, undermine Arab attempts to resolve the crisis, muscle the UN to do U.S. bidding, and finally use its high-tech weaponry to slaughter Iraqi soldiers at will. Though the war sparked widespread opposition, the Bush administration swept it aside, squelched all motion toward a post-Cold War peace dividend, and sent a deadly message to all those who would challenge U.S. power in the Third World. The sum total of all these events, but the Soviet collapse above all, fundamentally reconfigured world politics. On the positive side, the Cold War, with its humanity-threatening dangers and the straitjacket it imposed on social progress, had been brought to an end. but the terms of this ending were terribly unfavorable to democratic, anti-imperialist, socialist, and revolutionary forces across the globe. Reconfiguration of the left. Inevitably, the reconfiguration of world politics led to a reconfiguration of the left. The biggest change was that the communist movement, main pole of attraction for revolutionary-minded people for more than 70 years, was shoved to the sidelines. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union, flagship of communism's largest current, split into several factions, and the largest adopted a hybrid of nationalist and social democratic ideology. Former ruling parties in Eastern Europe and several important CPs in the advanced capitalist countries abandoned communism, with West Europe's largest CP, the Communist Party of Italy, leading the way. Such defections were not as common in the Third World, but there too communist influence markedly declined. India's once formidable but long divided communist movement was badly weakened. The Maoist Philippine Party stalled and went through a debilitating series of splits. In the Middle East and Africa, outside South Africa, Marxism-Leninism lost its remaining prestige, with one-time proponents such as Mozambique's Frelimo giving up the ghost. The Cuban and Vietnamese CPs held on to power but faced tremendous economic difficulties and increasing internal dissent. North Korea, run by the world's first communist family dynasty, became an international example of hunger and suffering. In the U.S., the CPUSA went through a significant split at the end of 1991, with up to a third of its 2,500 remaining members breaking away after criticizing the Gus Hall leadership for clinging to Stalinist procedures, restricting inter-party democracy, failing to appreciate the potential of the Jackson Rainbow movement, and giving only lip service to the party's traditional position on the centrality of black liberation. The dissidents went on to form the nucleus of a new group, the Committees of Correspondence, which emerged as the major 1990s regroupment effort on the U.S. left. The world's surviving CPs called various conferences in attempts to assess the damage and bounce back, but the spiral downward could not be reversed. Beyond general proclamations of loyalty to Marxism-Leninism, political differences between the various parties were greater than ever, and no single party or alignment of parties commanded ideological authority. Even at the height of the Sino-Soviet dispute, the world's Marxist-Leninists had not been reduced to such dire straits. But with the demise of the USSR, the era of the communist movement having a special place on the left ended as well, and there is no evidence that Marxism-Leninism's resurrection lies anywhere on the horizon. The communist movement's best established far-left rival, Trotskyism, was unable to take much advantage of this debacle. Trotskyist groups claimed that their analysis of the USSR as a degenerated worker state had been validated by events. But even among activists who found themselves sympathetic to this argument, there was no significant movement toward joining the Trotskyist movement. Rather, the predominant early 1990s pull on Leninist veterans, new activists, and militant workers alike was to communism's right. This meant that by 1991 social democracy had become the overwhelmingly dominant current within the international socialist left. But social democracy was not revitalized by the conversion of numerous ex-communists. Rather, most social democratic parties were steadily moving rightwards along with the overall drift of capitalist politics. Indeed, despite gains at the expense of communism, world social democracy was enmeshed in a deep if less spectacular crisis of its own. The major case in point was France, where socialist leader François Mitterrand, heading a common front of socialists and communists, had won the presidency in 1981 with promises of radical reform. But by 1983 Mitterrand's project had stalled. He was imposing austerity on the French working class, the communists had quit his government, and social democrats worldwide were acknowledging that their most promising model for bringing about progressive change had failed. In the US, the basic direction was the same but not as extreme, since DSA was not in any position to contend for governmental power. In 1989, DSA navigated the difficult transition following the death of leader Michael Harrington, and in the very early 1990s grew to its zenith of 11,000-plus members, exceeding the total of all other socialist organizations combined. But the group had more and more trouble maintaining an activist dimension, and its long-standing strategy of positioning itself within the left wing of the Democratic Party became less and less effective as that wing lost influence to the Clinton-ism of the Democratic Leadership Council. With all traditional socialist trends stagnant or in outright collapse, the limited amount of momentum attained by self-identified socialists came in the form of ideological and organizational hybrids. In a few countries, innovative multi-tendency projects gathered enough popular support to attract international interest. The largest of these were the Brazil Workers' Party, whose main leader, Luiz Ignacio da Silva Lula, almost won the presidency in 1989, the German Party of Democratic Socialism, spearheaded by democratic-minded leaders of the former East German ruling party and including radicals from a range of ideological traditions, and Italy's Communist Refoundation, founded by former PCI members who refused to go along with the majority's turn to social democracy. In most other countries, and especially in the US, the most vibrant radical movements of the late 1980s and early 1990s took inspiration from currents outside of socialism. Green movements and identity politics during these years galvanized much more support than Marxism. Groups like Queer Nation, founded 1990, the Lesbian Avengers 1992, and Riot Girl 1991, took ACT-UP's in-your-face direct action politics to a new level. On campuses, student activism revived somewhat, but its main expressions, the Student Environmental Action Coalition, which hosted the largest ever radical student gathering in U.S. history, with 7,600 attendees in 1990, or the Student Action Union, formed at a conference at Rutgers in 1988, took little from Marxism. On the publishing front, the success story of the 1980s was the progressive but decidedly non-socialist Nation, and the main new entry, 1988, was Z Magazine, more activist-oriented and radical than the Nation but also not friendly to Marxism. The growing environmental justice movement, which achieved nationwide prominence via the 1991 National People of Color Environmental Summit, addressed the intersection of race, class, and the environment in a manner closer to the traditional Marxist paradigm. But though many veteran Marxists played important roles, no socialist organization had much influence on the movement's development. The main survivors' collapse. All these developments in world socialism, along with the demise of the rainbow, confronted the last significant survivors of the new communist movement with a whole new set of problems. It's no surprise that they were engulfed. Not that Marxism-Leninism's crisis per Southeast was the immediate trigger for the dissolution of either LRAs or Line of March. Rather, the catalysts in both cases were practical difficulties that under other circumstances might have been overcome. But the worldwide crisis of communism made it impossible for either group to traverse even minor bumps in the road without facing ideological questions that called their basic identity into question. Line of March went into crisis first, having achieved modest success, especially in the 1984 Rainbow. During the mid-1980s, Line of March saw numerous openings for its united front against war and racism perspective to gain influence. The prospect of increased clout tantalized the organization's leadership, which turned from its earlier stress on theoretical analysis and careful organization building toward an advance on all fronts push in mass organizing. Demands on cadre were increased, and by 1986 the organization was immersed in a voluntarist attempt to attain a following comparable to the far larger CPUSA or DSA. For a year or so the toll taken by this crusade was hidden by the organization's growing influence, but such a frantic pace could not be sustained. By late 1987, Line of March was overstretched, and any one of a dozen things could have punctured its bubble. As it happened, the center of the organization cracked under the pressure first. The chair of the Line of March Executive Committee, Bruce Oksina, developed a debilitating case of substance abuse. After this was discovered in September 1987, the rest of the leadership was forced to confront the fact that the group had been operating in a dysfunctional manner for some time. Initially, the center attempted to correct matters by slowing the pace of activity and taking a few small steps toward leadership accountability, but when the center opened up discussion of the organization's problems to the full membership, the terms of debate quickly shifted. For 2 years, the Line of March had been promoting the value of glasnost, perestroika, and democratization in the USSR, and the membership decided that a new level of openness, restructuring, and democracy was necessary within their own organization. The result was a 2-year-long campaign of re-examination, redirection, and democratization which progressed from self-criticism for voluntarism and an undemocratic internal structure to a critique of vanguardism and sectarianism rooted in some of the traditional orthodoxies of Marxism-Leninism. A short-lived minority faction balked, arguing that Line of March still represented the nucleus of a new vanguard. But the overwhelming majority felt enthusiastic about a re-evaluation that targeted ideological and structural problems, rather than individual failings, as the cause of the organization's and the broader left's difficulties. Members also felt that in some small way the process they were going through was linked to the renovating currents then inspiring communists across the globe. This provided the basis for the Line of March to continue its mass work and to play as prominent a role in the 1988 Rainbow Jackson effort as it had in 1984. The critique of vanguardism also pushed the organization to reach out to other socialist groups and individuals and share its self-criticisms. Line of March had long paid more attention to tracking other socialist trends than did other party-building groups, and now it sought to transform long-standing rivalries into cooperative relationships, particularly with other organizations in the Rainbow Left and with the CPUSA. Line of March succeeded in improving its ties with other activists, but this in itself could not keep the organization afloat. Most cadres still agreed with the broad contours of the United Front Against War and Racism strategy, but in shedding allegiance to Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy and to party building as the central task, the organization was left without a foundation, and for obvious reasons the group's self-confidence, energy level and political prospects were hard hit by the demise of the Rainbow and the failure of Soviet perestroika. So when the re-examination process ended in fall 1989, the 200 or so remaining members sought to find a safe harbor by engaging with other socialists in a broader left renewal project. The group voted to disband Line of March and devote their remaining resources to a new regroupment-oriented magazine. Their main partner was the North Star Network, and the organizational scaffolding of the new endeavor would come from merging Line of March's bi-weekly newspaper Frontline with that network's magazine, North Star Review. The new publication, Crossroads, was launched in 1990 on the basis of funds and cadre mainly from the former Line of March and a left regroupment approach first advocated by North Star. Other circles and individual activists from other sections of the new communist movement as well as other socialist traditions also participated, formed just as the upheaval in world communism was reaching its height. The magazine soon found itself intersecting with the even broader left convergence that following the explosion in the CPUSA at its December 1991 convention. The dissident CPUSA members who left to form the committees of correspondence after that gathering were those who had been most positive about the Rainbow and most in agreement that Soviet society was in need of radical change. Thus, on a number of key political points, they had arrived at conclusions similar to those of the former anti-revisionists who were at the core of Crossroads. Likewise, these former CPers aimed to bring a dose of democratization into the communist tradition, and were eager to varying degrees to work with activists from a variety of traditions in building a new activist, socialist group. With 500 to 1,000 ex-CPers as an initial core, the new committees attracted a reasonably broad range of activists from the socialist left. Crossroads, while not formally affiliating with the committees, gave the group extensive and positive coverage. Then many individuals from Crossroads circles joined. The first national conference of the committees was held in Berkeley in July 1992, drawing 1,300. Although veterans of the new communist movement played a role in the committees, they were not central in shaping the group's direction. That role was held by the ex-CP Corps along with a few other prominent individuals, most notably Manning Marable. After 1992, the committees of correspondence lost much of its initial momentum and energy, but it has survived and established itself as an active and non-sectarian, if small, force on the much shrunken socialist left. Crossroads, on the other hand, was unable to sustain itself past the period 1990-94, where left regroupment was not simply a hope but a practical movement gripping at least a few thousand activists. After making a determined but resource-starved effort to link up more closely with the new 1990s generation of activists, Crossroads ceased publication in 1996. LRS dissolves. The trigger for LRS's dissolution lay in a different set of problems accompanying a measure of success. LRS's combination of hard work, cultivation of ties with influential leaders, and deployment of mostly secret members had produced results. A number of cadre attained high posts within progressive organizations, including what remained of the Rainbow apparatus, and LRS members assumed control of a number of student and community groups. But as LRS utilized its positioning to expand its influence and limit that of rivals, charges that a hidden apparatus was manipulating things began to multiply. Some attacks were little more than simple red baiting, but LRS's reliance on secret membership combined with its drive for organizational positioning had produced situations where more than the anti-communism of some opponents was at work. As LRS grappled with the problem, it soon became clear that a strong tendency in the organization was more concerned with maintaining positions of influence than with allegiance to Marxism-Leninism. Years of giving short shrift to Marxist theory and shunning the rest of the left had left the organization ill-equipped to deal with a dramatically changed world, at least from a revolutionary point of view. Through the 1970s, identification with communism and the Chinese Communist Party had been a source of strength. But after the Tiananmen massacre and Soviet collapse, Marxism-Leninism was far more of a burden than an asset. For many, the logical conclusion was to shed Marxism-Leninism, and in early 1990 the LRA Center suggested precisely that. It proposed that the group drop Marxism, party building and democratic centralism, and become a network of organizers united on the basis of a non-ideological progressive program. It was hoped that this change would be made smoothly and quickly in order to cause the least disruption in the group's political work. Most of the 1980s generation, which now made up the majority of the membership, supported the change, as did most IWK veterans. But it was too drastic for a layer of longtime cadre, mainly from the ETI and Morsia PRCL. The ensuing faction fight broke no new theoretical ground, with one member writing that both sides retreat into the past. The majority is retreating into an eclectic and pragmatic left nationalism, and the minority is retreating into a stale and dogmatic Marxist orthodoxy. After a sharp but very brief debate, the Central Committee voted on September 8, 1990 by a large margin to dissolve the organization. It then issued a public statement that upheld the history of the LRS as overwhelmingly positive, stressed the group's contributions to the struggles of communities of color, and downplayed its long allegiance to Maoism. After dissolution, the majority faction made a half-hearted attempt to implement the original transformation proposal, founding the short-lived Unity Organizing Network. But without the glue of ideology or democratic centralism, the group's apparatus dissipated within a year or two. Besides everything else, the central leadership was suffering from ideological fatigue and exerted little energy to try to make the project work. Individual cadre who were well positioned in popular movements mostly continued their progressive activism, and several attained even higher posts or elected public office, but they were no longer part of any collective project. The minority faction, about 100, formed the Socialist Organizing Network, SON. At the end of 1992, SON's remaining members joined the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, with whom they shared a common pro-China history. The Guardian's demise. The early 1990s also marked the end of the line for the Guardian, which had played such a pivotal role in the new communist movement during the 1970s. Facing ever-increasing competition from in these times and badly hurt by the post-1989 decline of the Marxist left and anti-imperialist solidarity movements, the Guardian entered the new decade in precarious shape, in keeping with its 1980s posture of backing a non-sectarian convergence of tendencies to the left of social democracy. In 1991-92, the paper gave favorable coverage to the committees of correspondence. The Guardian's support was returned by activists on the ground, but the limitations of the early 1990s regroupment motion were highlighted when, right at its height in the summer of 1992, financial woes caught up with the Guardian, and the paper folded. At the very end, the collapse was abrupt. The staff was unable or unwilling to face the depth of the crisis, and in the final months made no attempt to enlist readers or sympathetic organizations in a rescue attempt. The final issue did not even include an announcement that the end had come. Even considering the staff's poor showing, the debacle underscored the battered state of the Marxist left. Less than a year later, in January 1993, the worldwide shake-up in communism finally reached that bastion of pro-Stalin orthodoxy, the Communist Labor Party. Though in an unusual and only partial way, at its 6th Congress the CLP dissolved and called for the formation of a new group. This was projected as a mass revolutionary organization united around a political program rather than a vanguard party based on Marxist-Leninist ideology. The leadership's rationale was that a new stage of class polarization had been reached. Supposedly up until then, spontaneous movements had aimed only for reforms, so a traditional Leninist party was needed. But now millions of impoverished people, in order to survive, were forced to challenge the system as such. Thus an objective mass revolutionary movement was coming into being, and a broader organizational form was needed to encompass its ideologically diverse core of militant fighters. The CLP had completed its task of molding a solid core of revolutionary leaders, and the time had come to deploy them as the scaffolding of a larger organization. Nothing in the CLP's analysis referred to the crisis of the communist movement or socialist countries. To the contrary, the final party documents denied that members were giving up one bit of Marxism-Leninism, and indeed the new organization carried over many features of its predecessor. It had a different name, first the National Organizing Committee, then after 1995 the League of Revolutionaries for a New America, but its publications continued to be called People's Tribune newspaper and Rally, Comrades, Bulletin. Perhaps most important of all, the CLP leadership continued as the LRNA central core virtually intact. But disbanding an explicitly ideological organization inevitably brought changes, diminishing the role of Marxist-Leninist doctrine in it and weakening its previous iron discipline. The other group that entered the 1990s as a defender of Stalin, the Marxist-Leninist Party, had declined by this point to under 75 members, and the majority voted to disband in November 1993. Scant organizational tracks. As a result of these dissolutions and transformations, by the mid-1990s the organizational tracks of the new communist movement had all but completely disappeared. Even in comparison with the mid-1980s, the decline was conspicuous. 5 of the 6 organizations that once declared themselves new vanguards, the CPML, CLP, CPUSML, MLP and CWP, had dissolved. So had the 2 most active groups of the mid and late 1980s, LREs and Line of March, as well as most of the movement's smaller formations. The League of Revolutionaries for a New America survived, but while it could claim an anti-revisionist heritage and deploy many skilled organizers, it no longer defined itself as a Marxist-Leninist party. The RCP continued to field a number of energetic cadre, and its one-time rival Peel still existed, but both functioned on the extreme margins of the left and were shadows of their former selves. FRSO carried on with its effort to combine Maoist ideology with some kind of sensible and non-sectarian mass practice, but the group was too small to maintain a regular publication and then, in 1999, underwent an organizational split. As of this writing, both factions claim rights to the organization's name, while one is attempting a new left regroupment project under the slogan of Left Refoundation. It is unlikely that a single one of the 1,200 activists who turned out with such high hopes for the Guardian-sponsored forum entitled What Road to Building a New Communist Party in March 1973 could have even imagined that 25 years later their movement would be so nearly invisible. But the popular 1970s Maoist prediction, "The future is bright, the road is tortuous," had proven only half correct, and not the inspiring half that once infused the new communist movement with tremendous self-confidence and revolutionary zeal.